You remember the first time you heard about the golden tickets? That feeling that the whole world was buzzing with possibility, that somewhere out there, a chocolate factory existed where dreams were real and children could experience everything they'd never dared to imagine. You remember that feeling, don't you? Good. Hold on to it, because I'm going to tear it apart right now, word by word, scene by scene, and when I'm done, you will never be able to look at a candy bar the same way again. Willy Wonka was not an eccentric. He was not a dreamer. He was not a genius confectioner with unresolved childhood trauma. Willy Wonka was a predator, a calculating psychopath who spent years, maybe decades, building a perfect trap with sugar walls and cookie floors that smelled like vanilla and ended in disappearance. And those 5 golden tickets, those objects that the entire world chased with fever, that appeared on newscasts and filled children's eyes with hope, they were not prizes. They were summons. They were the sentences of a judge who had already decided the verdict before any trial ever began. But let's take this slow, because the proof of what I'm telling you isn't found in loose theories. It's in the scenes themselves. It's in the details the film puts right there on screen and expects you to ignore because the music is too catchy and the set design too colorful for anyone to stop and ask, wait, what is actually happening here? Think about the structure. Think about the cold logic underneath everything. A chocolate factory locked shut for years with no human workers, no visitors, no contact whatsoever with the outside world. A man who completely vanished from public life and suddenly decides to open his doors to 5 children chosen by, what? A lottery. By luck. By the chance of finding a golden slip of paper inside a candy bar. That's what we were asked to swallow. And we swallowed it. Happily. Because the theater was beautifully staged, the costumes were magnificent, and the soundtrack convinced you that you were watching a fairy tale. You weren't. You were watching a hunt. Willy Wonka chose every single one of those children. Augustus Gloop, the German boy who ate compulsively, who had already appeared in newspapers for devouring chocolates at an alarming rate, whose only relationship with the world was the food he stuffed into his mouth, as if the act of chewing filled some enormous void inside him. Violet Beauregard, the American girl who chewed gum with an almost violent arrogance, who competed, who needed to win always, who had built her entire identity around pride. Veruca Salt, the British girl whose father had mobilized hundreds of factory workers to unwrap chocolate bars until the ticket was found. A child who had never heard the word no, who confused desire with entitlement and whim with necessity. Mike TV, the American boy addicted to television, wrapped in toy revolvers, violent in his fantasies, impatient with anything that required effort or attention. And Charlie Bucket, the only one Wonka had no intention of eliminating, the only one for whom the maze had no trap, because Charlie was not a target. Charlie was the prize. Charlie was the final piece of the plan. And the difference between Charlie and the others was not kindness. It was not purity of heart the way the film wants you to believe. The difference was that Charlie was malleable. Charlie was poor enough to be grateful. Charlie was desperate enough to accept anything. Charlie was the perfect candidate to become the next Willy Wonka, to take the throne of a kingdom that was not a factory, but a dungeon, to become not the heir of a dream, but the new warden of a hell that smelled like caramel. But before we get to Charlie's fate, we need to talk about the design. We need to talk about the architecture of punishment, because Willy Wonka did not improvise a single thing. Every hallway, every room, every river, every machine, every button, and every staircase was calculated with a surgical precision that goes beyond engineering and enters the territory of criminal psychology. Wonka studied his victims. Wonka knew their sins. And Wonka built an environment that was specific, personalized, and inevitable, designed to make each child be destroyed by the very flaw they carried inside themselves. This concept has a name in classical literature. It has a name that Dante Alighieri used centuries ago when he imaginarily descended through the funnel of hell and found that each soul was not tortured randomly, but poetically, mirrored, in a way where the punishment was always the perfect reflection of the sin. The glutton drowning in filth, the proud carrying boulders that curve the spine, the greedy rolling weights forever. Dante understood that the cruelest hell is not the one that punishes generically. The cruelest hell is the one that uses the very nature of the condemned soul as the instrument of its own destruction. Willy Wonka read Dante. I'm certain of it, because the chocolate factory is not a factory. It is a map of hell drawn with sugar and light and color, where each room corresponds to a circle of punishment, and each child was selected because they carried exactly the sin that room was designed to devour. Let's start with Augustus Gloop, the first to fall, the first to disappear, and not by accident. Augustus was overweight. Augustus ate too much. Augustus Gloop was a walking allegory of gluttony, the capital sin that Dante places in the third circle of hell, where souls are forced to lie in foul mud beneath an eternal rain of hail and filthy water, while Cerberus, the three-headed dog, tears at them with his claws. The punishment of gluttony in Dante is the degradation of the body. It is the human being reduced to their most animal impulse, to the pure and thoughtless act of consuming. It is the loss of dignity in the most visceral way possible. Wonka placed Augustus in front of a river of chocolate. A river, not a bowl, not a sample. An entire river of chocolate, warm, flowing, irresistible for a boy whose entire life had been oriented by this impulse to consume. And the river was there, accessible, right at the edge of the path, without protection, without a barrier, without any real obstacle between Augustus and the liquid that would consume him. You think that was a safety oversight? You think Willy Wonka, a man who built an entire factory operated by tiny creatures with supernatural efficiency, who designed machines capable of turning chocolate into television signals, who created a piece of gum that replicated a full 3-course meal, you think that man forgot to put a guardrail next to the river? No, he did not forget. He didn't put one there because the absence of protection was part of the design. The river was built to be irresistible and dangerous at the same time, a combination that only kills a very specific type of person, the one who cannot resist temptation, even when the temptation is clearly in a forbidden place. Augustus's gluttony was not physical weakness, it was moral weakness, and Wonka used it with the precision of a surgeon. Augustus leaned over. Augustus fell. Augustus was sucked through the pipe, while Wonka's pink umbrella framed the scene with tranquil detachment, and the man's only reaction was a slight shrug, a soft comment about the filtration process, and the most disturbing facial expression you will ever see in a children's film. The expression of someone who expected exactly that outcome and is simply waiting for the next item on the agenda to be executed. And then, the boat. I need to talk about the boat now, and I need your full attention because this is the moment when the mask comes completely off, when the veil of fiction tears wide open and what appears underneath is so cold, so calculated, so absolutely monstrous that most people walk right past it without seeing it, because they cannot bring themselves to believe the film would show us something this obvious, this openly. After Augustus disappears down the pipe, Wonka leads the remaining group to the boat, a dark wooden boat, long and narrow, that sails down the chocolate river toward the next circle. And the boat has exactly enough seats for the number of people left in the group. Let me repeat that more slowly so the full weight of it sinks in. Augustus is gone. The group that entered the factory had, counting children and their guardians, 10 people plus Wonka. After Augustus and his mother are redirected, the group has 8 people plus Wonka, and the boat seats 8 people plus Wonka. Exactly. No empty seats, no space for anyone else, no room for anyone who might still be coming. This is not a coincidence. This is not a detail the film dropped in without thinking. This is a confession. This is the screenplay, whether Roald Dahl's original novel or its cinematic adaptation. Letting slip through the surface of a children's story the clearest possible proof that Willy Wonka knew in advance how many people would reach the boat. And the only way to know how many people would reach the boat was to know that Augustus Gloop would not. And the only way to know Augustus would not make it was to be certain that the trap would work, because the trap was built specifically for him. Wonka was not afraid of losing a passenger. Wonka was executing a script. Wonka was the director of a performance in which every exit had been rehearsed, timed, and confirmed before the curtains ever opened. And the Oompa Loompas, those small, strange creatures with painted faces and songs perpetually at the tip of their tongues, The Oompa Loompas did not have ready songs because they were naturally talented. They had ready songs because they had prior knowledge of specific punishments. They knew Augustus's name before Augustus fell. They knew Violet's behavior before Violet grabbed the gum. They had been briefed about each victim by someone who knew what each victim would do. That someone was Wonka, who knew what each child would do because he had studied each child enough to predict with surgical precision the moment, the location, and the method of their downfall. The factory tour was not an excursion. It was a script, and every child was following the lines Wonka had written for them without knowing any text existed at all. Think about the structure of a song. Think about how long it takes to write lyrics, to compose a melody, to choreograph movements, to rehearse a full performance. That doesn't happen in 30 seconds after an accident. That takes days, weeks. The Oompa Loompas' songs were not improvisations. They were memories. They were pieces that had been written, rehearsed, and filed away, waiting only for the right moment to be executed. And the right moments had been scheduled before the factory doors ever opened. If you still have any doubt about the premeditation, I want you to remember Wonka's tone during each disaster. There is no startled reaction. There is no horror. There is not even performative surprise beyond a few "oh dears" and "goodnesses" delivered with the cadence of a man reciting text he memorized a long time ago. Wonka watches Augustus get sucked through the pipe, and his eyes carry the emotional temperature of someone watching water boil. Because for him, it was literally that. A process that had been calculated and that was unfolding exactly as expected. Violet Beauregard. The second circle. Violet chewed gum because she needed to win. She didn't need flavor, didn't need pleasure, she needed the record. The gum was a trophy. The gum was proof that she was the best, the toughest, the most dedicated, the most superior. Violet was pride and arrogance incarnated in an American girl with her hair pulled back and an arrogance so dense it almost occupied physical space. Violet's father encouraged this arrogance as though it were a virtue. Violet's father applauded his daughter with the enthusiasm of a coach who mistakes competitive cruelty for excellence of character. And Wonka introduced the three-course meal gum, an experimental piece of gum. A piece of gum that Wonka made clear was not yet ready, that there was a problem with the dessert course, that he strongly recommended no one try it. A clear prohibition, a direct warning. And Violet grabbed the gum anyway, because Violet could not hear the word no when there was an implicit competition at stake. Because somewhere in the deep and twisted psychology of Violet Beauregard, chewing the gum that the inventor had said not to chew was a victory. It was proving she was braver, bolder, more special than anyone else in the group. Violet's pride destroyed her from the inside out, literally. The gum transformed her. Each phase was described by Wonka with the clinical neutrality of a doctor describing symptoms he knows by heart. The nose changes, the color changes, the size changes. Violet swells. Violet becomes unrecognizable. Violet stops being Violet and becomes something else. A purple, enormous round thing that rolled across the floor while the Oompa Loompas were already in position, already with the melody on their lips, already choreographed, already executing the performative punishment that had been prepared for this specific moment. The biological horror of what happens to Violet is disturbing in a way that the film's colorful tone tries to muffle, but cannot completely suppress. She is still conscious inside there. She is still present. The Violet who laughed and chewed and competed still exists inside that deformed purple shape. And no one, not her father, not Wonka, not any of the other adults in the group, demonstrates the reaction any human being would have upon watching a child transform into something that is no longer recognizably human. And if you ask where Violet ended up, where she went after the Oompa Loompas rolled her out of the room, the film does not answer. Roald Dahl's original book is more honest about her fate, but even in the cinema's softened version, you never see Violet leave the factory the way she arrived. You see a child who walked through the door as a human being and whom the narrative discarded as a solved problem. But I need to pause here for just a second, because this analysis is reaching a very heavy point, and you've been following me this far with an attention that deserves to be acknowledged. If this theory is getting under your skin, if you're starting to look at these films through completely different eyes, I want to ask you something. Drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and in the comments, tell me which punishment in the factory disturbs you the most. Because we haven't reached the darkest ones yet. Trust me on that. Veruca Salt. The third circle, Veruca is interesting in a specific way because she is the only character whose sin is not entirely her own. Veruca is greed, is avarice, is the insatiable desire to have everything without deserving anything. But Veruca was built that way. Veruca's father bought the golden ticket. Veruca's father mobilized an industrial army to find the access to the paradise his daughter demanded. Veruca's father had taught the child since birth that any desire was legitimate if you had enough money to fulfill it. Veruca Salt was not a spoiled child. She was a child who had been engineered into entitlement by a man who never once told her that the world did not exist to serve her personally. And then Veruca entered the squirrel room. Squirrels, not the geese of some older adaptations. Squirrels that tested nuts, cracking them open with mechanical precision and tapping them to determine whether they were hollow or solid. And Veruca wanted a squirrel. Veruca demanded a squirrel. Veruca did what she had done her entire life, pointed at the object of her desire, and waited for the universe to reorganize itself around her whim. The squirrel evaluated Veruca, not with curiosity, not with fear, but with the cold objectivity of a quality control mechanism executing its function. The squirrel tapped Veruca's head, and the sound it heard was hollow, and then the other squirrels joined, and Veruca Salt was classified as a bad nut and discarded. Discarded. Through the opening in the floor that led to the factory's garbage chute, a child literally thrown in the trash, sliding down a disposal chute that would place her alongside everything else the factory had deemed without value. And Veruca's father, attempting to rescue her, was evaluated the same way and discarded alongside her. And Wonka. Wonka was standing there with that vague, distant expression, murmuring something about incineration and whether today was Incineration Day or not. Stop right there. Incineration. The factory garbage leads to an incinerator. And Wonka is not sure whether today is Incineration Day, which means he knows it might be, which means he was willing to leave that possibility open while a child and an adult slid down that chute toward a fate that could be, or could not be, lethal. That uncertainty is not carelessness. That uncertainty is calculated cruelty. Wonka knew the fire was part of the equation and chose not to remove that element. Mike TV. The fourth circle. Mike is different. Mike is not a child of a single transparent sin. Mike is a child of multiple flaws that feed on each other. The sloth that kept him seated in front of the television, passive, consuming manufactured violence without ever moving, without ever creating, without ever actively participating in the real world. The wrath that explodes out of him in moments of frustration. The irritability of a child who grew up without real limits and cannot tolerate the resistance of reality. And a peculiar intellectual arrogance. Mike believed he understood things better than everyone else, that technical intelligence was superior to any other way of being human. Mike was the kid who thought the adults in the room were all idiots and made zero effort to hide it. Wonka introduced the television room, a room where chocolate could be transmitted through television waves, dematerialized, sent through the air, and rematerialized on a screen. The most seductive technology imaginable for a boy whose entire life had been lived inside a screen. And Wonka said with complete clarity that the process had only been tested with chocolates, that people should not be transmitted, that there were unknown risks. Mike did not listen. Mike calculated. Mike believed he understood enough to bypass the risks Wonka had outlined. Mike stepped into the television transmission process and arrived on the other side less than a foot tall. The horror of Mike TV is not merely physical, it is existential. Mike was a boy who looked down on the world around him for being too slow, too stupid, too small to deserve his attention. And the universe sent him back literally small. The punishment mirrors the sin with an irony so sharp it cuts. The boy who thought everything was too small to be worth his time was reduced to the size of an insect. And the only solution offered for this problem involved a taffy pulling machine that might potentially stretch him back to normal size, a machine that Wonka mentioned with the casual concern of someone discussing a slightly risky dry cleaning process. Every punishment, every room, every tragedy, all mirrored, all symmetrical, all poetic in the darkest way that term can carry. Dante, in Canto 5 of the Inferno, describes the lustful being swept by eternal winds with no direction or rest. In Canto 7th, the greedy and the wasteful roll weights in opposing semicircles, condemned to collide forever. In Canto 15th, the violent walk beneath a rain of fire. Every punishment is designed so that the soul recognizes in it the reflection of what it was in life. There is no arbitrariness in Dante's hell. There is poetic justice. There is moral symmetry. There is the idea that sin is not punished from outside, but unfolded from within, amplified until it becomes eternal. Wonka read Dante, and Wonka built not a factory, but an allegory, a physical space where the moral nature of each visitor would be used as a weapon against itself, where gluttony would be drowned in the object of its desire, where pride would be deformed until unrecognizable, where greed would be thrown away like garbage, where sloth and wrath would be miniaturized into irrelevance. And here, we need to talk about the Oompa Loompas with more seriousness than the film asks us to. The Oompa Loompas are disturbing on a level that most people never stop to articulate. They are creatures of obscure origin, brought by Wonka from a place he vaguely describes as Loompa Land, a place of misery and danger from which they were supposedly rescued in exchange for labor. Think about the structure of that relationship. Creatures removed from their native habitat, transplanted into a sealed factory without contact with the outside world, working in exchange for cacao beans and protection. Think about how that would be described if there were no candy involved. Think about what we would call it if the creatures were human and the employer was not a character in a children's film. And the Oompa Loompas know about the punishments. They do not merely witness them. They do not merely describe them afterward. They choreograph them. They appear already positioned, already harmonized, already with the lyrics memorized, and they execute performances that would demand weeks of rehearsal from any human group. What this means is that the Oompa Loompas had specific prior knowledge, not just of punishments in general, but of individual punishments. They knew Augustus's name before Augustus fell. They knew Violet's behavior before Violet grabbed the gum. They had been briefed about each victim by someone who knew what each victim would do. That someone was Wonka, who knew what each child would do because he had studied each child enough to predict with surgical precision the moment, the location, and the form of their downfall. The factory tour was not an excursion. It was a script, and every child was following the lines Wonka had written for them without knowing any text existed. But perhaps the most disturbing element of the entire theory is not any of the intermediate disappearances. Perhaps the most disturbing element is the ending. What is presented as the happiest moment in the film? The moment Charlie wins the factory. Charlie Bucket survived the maze. But what exactly does that mean? Charlie was not spared because he was too good to be trapped. Charlie was spared because he did not carry the specific type of sin that the traps were designed to catch. Augustus was caught by gluttony, and Charlie, who was genuinely poor and frequently hungry, had never developed the compulsive relationship with food that defined Augustus. Violet was caught by competitive pride, and Charlie, who grew up without ever having resources to compete for anything, did not carry that kind of arrogance. Veruca was caught by the greed of someone who had always had everything, and Charlie, who had never had anything, did not even know how to construct that kind of relationship with desire. Mike was caught by violent passivity, and Charlie, who spent his days imagining chocolates he could rarely afford to eat, had an active inner life, not one numbed by television. Charlie was not good. Charlie was poor, and poverty had accidentally, by a cruel irony, protected Charlie from the specific forms of corruption that Wonka's traps were designed to exploit. But the big question, the question that the happy ending tries to bury under music and hugs and the image of a glass elevator breaking through the factory roof, is, why did Wonka need a successor at all? The official answer is sentimental. Wonka was lonely. Wonka wanted to share his magic. Wonka needed someone to carry on his legacy. Let's dismantle that. A man who built a prison disguised as a factory, who planned the disappearance of 4 children with the precision of a serial operator, who maintains an army of creatures in conditions that would not survive any ethical analysis, who tests products on sentient beings without consent, This man had a loneliness episode and decided to adopt an heir. What kind of sentimentality would produce that conclusion? Wonka needed a successor because the operation could not stop. The factory needed to keep running. The Oompa Loompas needed a manager. The experiments needed oversight. The system of selection and punishment that had been carefully constructed over decades needed someone who understood its logic and could perpetuate it. And Charlie was perfect for that role, not because he was too good to be corrupted, but because he was young enough, impressionable enough, and desperate enough to be shaped. Charlie had grown up in a family that barely managed to eat, in a bedroom shared with 4 elderly grandparents, in a condition of deprivation that had taught him to value any generosity in a disproportionate way. Charlie had no references for opulence, no means of comparison, no cynicism available to question the gift he was receiving. The glass elevator is not an ascension to paradise. It is the moment of purchase, the moment when Charlie's soul was acquired, and Charlie accepted. Charlie accepted bringing his entire family inside the factory. Charlie accepted the proposal of taking over the business. Charlie accepted the gift without reading the terms and conditions. Because when you grow up with nothing, the first person who offers you everything looks like a savior. And saviors are dangerous in a very specific way. They create debts that are never articulated, but never erased. The Bucket family moved into Willy Wonka's chocolate factory and never came back out. The end of the film presents this as a happy ending. A family united inside a magical space where love is enough and chocolates never run out. But what you see when you remove the golden filter is a family that has been transferred inside the walls of an operation whose true nature they don't understand at all, that no longer has contact with the outside world, that is now under the custody of a man who planned the disappearance of 4 children that same week. Charlie will grow up inside the factory. Charlie will learn the processes. Charlie will come to know the Oompa Loompas by name, will understand how the rooms function, will gradually discover, if he hasn't already, that the traps were not accidents. And what Charlie will do with that knowledge, what any child would do growing up inside this system and beginning to understand how it operates, is the question the film deliberately never asks, because the answer would be unbearable for the kind of story it wants to be. The answer, if you follow the logic of this theory, is that Charlie will perpetuate the system. Because that is what institutional trauma does. That is what happens when you grow up inside a sufficiently total power structure. You learn its values, you internalize its logic, you eventually become one of its operators, not necessarily out of malice, sometimes simply because you don't know another way to exist, because the factory has become the only world there is, because Wonka was the most present and powerful father figure of your entire formative life. And there it is, the complete cycle. Wonka ages. Wonka passes the torch. Charlie assumes the role. One day, decades from now, Charlie Bucket will sit in his inventing room and design a new set of traps. Will study a new group of children. Will hide golden tickets inside chocolate bars. And some child on the other side of the country will find one of those tickets and will scream with joy because they will believe they have won the luck of a lifetime, and the cycle will begin again. Before we go further, do me a quick favor. If this analysis is leaving you with a chill you can't quite name, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which of these children's fates you find the most disturbing. Every comment helps me keep making content that goes straight to the places popular culture prefers to leave in the dark. But I'm not finished yet, because there is a layer to this theory that is more subtle and more disturbing than any we've covered so far. It's the layer that has to do not with what Wonka did, but with what the story asks us to feel about what Wonka did. Roald Dahl wrote the original novel published in 1964. Dahl was a writer who was not afraid to place inside children's narratives elements of cruelty, injustice, and violence that other authors in the genre would soften or eliminate entirely. Dahl believed children were more resilient than adults gave them credit for, that they could process the darkness of life better than they were assumed to be capable of, and that stories pretending the world was only safe and fair did a real disservice to the children who would eventually need to inhabit the real world. Which means, perhaps the cruelty of Wonka is not a misreading. Perhaps it is the correct reading. Perhaps Dahl intentionally constructed a protagonist who was morally ambiguous in ways that the film adaptations tried to soften, but could never completely eliminate, Because the narrative structure is too solid to be disguised by colorful sets and upbeat soundtracks. Consider the morality of Dahl's story from his own perspective. The children who are punished for the sins they carry. Augustus for gluttony, Violet for pride, Veruca for greed, Mike for wrath and sloth. There is an underlying moral logic that Dahl built consciously, derived from a much older tradition of storytelling in which consequences were proportional to transgressions. The classical moral fable is not gentle. The classical moral fable punishes. The classical moral fable uses terror as a pedagogical vehicle. What Wonka does in the factory is, in a charitable reading, the extreme version of a moral fable, and in an honest reading, it is the portrait of a punishment system that no child ever consented to face, administered by a figure of absolute authority who answers to no external system of control or justice. Because that detail might be the most disturbing one of all. There are no consequences for Wonka. The parents of the children who disappear inside the factory do not call the police. Or if they do, the story does not bother to tell us. No investigator appears at the factory door with a warrant. No Child Protective Services agency questions the whereabouts of Augustus Gloop, who was sucked through a pipe and sent to a filtration room that no outside camera has access to. Wonka operates in a zone of absolute impunity because the magic of the environment convinced not just the characters inside the story, but the audience outside it, that this space exists somehow above the rules that govern the real world, and that exemption from judgment, that performative impunity constructed with sugar and music, is perhaps the darkest allegory of all, because it suggests that power sufficiently presented with sufficient enchantment can convince an entire audience to watch children suffer without feeling any moral obligation to question what they are witnessing. We watched 4 children disappear inside a factory run by a man whose mental stability is questionable at best, and whose motivations are openly sadistic when you stop listening to the music and start looking at the evidence. And we walked out of the theater smiling, because the glass elevator was beautiful, because Charlie was likable, because the soundtrack told us everything was fine. It was not fine. It is not fine. It never was. Willy Wonka built a hell. Dante Alighieri would have recognized the architecture immediately. The gradual descent through the circles, each one deeper and more specific than the last, each designed so that the punishment was indistinguishable from the sin that motivated it. The chocolate river that drowns the glutton, the gum that deforms the proud, the garbage chute that swallows the greedy, the technology that miniaturizes the lazy. Each trap is a door that only opens when the specific moral flaw of the visitor applies enough pressure against it. And Wonka had spent decades calibrating those doors, adjusting the necessary pressure, ensuring that each mechanism responded to exactly the right type of weakness. But Dante's Inferno has 9 circles. Wonka's factory showed us only 4 punishments. What lies in the other corridors, what exists in the rooms that the group of visitors never reached, is a question that Dahl's book and the film adaptations wisely choose not to answer, because the answer would depend on what kinds of sins Wonka was still waiting to punish, and what kinds of children had not yet been summoned. The golden tickets that were found numbered 5, but who said there were only 5? Wonka had sealed the factory from the outside world entirely. Wonka controlled completely the production and distribution of his chocolates. Wonka could have inserted any number of tickets into any number of bars spread across any number of countries over any period of time. The official narrative says 5 golden tickets in a worldwide competition that lasted a few weeks. But the official narrative was written by Wonka, or at least communicated by him through the media channels he chose to use. How many visits happened before this one? How many children or adults entered through the factory doors over the years and never came back out to tell anyone about it? How many families received thank you letters signed by characters who no longer existed in the form they existed before walking through those gates? These are the thoughts that stay with you. These are the thoughts you carry home when the analysis ends and the video finishes, and you go to grab a candy bar from the kitchen, and you pause for just a second with it in your hand, staring at it like you're seeing it for the first time. The story of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is not a story about an eccentric confectioner who decides to share his magic with the world. It is a story about a system of selection and punishment, carefully disguised as generosity. It is a story about how absolute power can present itself as a gift and be accepted as one by people who are desperate enough or enchanted enough not to see what lies underneath the golden wrapper. It is a story about how we build spaces where certain individuals are above judgment, where certain rules simply do not apply, where brutality can be executed with impunity as long as it is executed with enough style and enough cheerful music playing in the background. It is a story Dante would recognize, a story criminal psychologists would recognize, a story that anyone who has studied how total control systems function would recognize immediately. And it is a story that was handed to us when we were too young to recognize what we were looking at, wrapped in fantasy and music, and the promise that good children are rewarded and bad children are punished, as if the world were that simple, as if punishment mechanisms were always just, as if the criteria for goodness were always transparent, and as if the man holding the keys to the kingdom always had the best intentions at heart. Willy Wonka had the worst. And Charlie Bucket, the wide-eyed boy with the pure heart who survived the maze, who received the keys to the castle and flew through the factory ceiling in a glass elevator with his grandfather laughing beside him. Charlie Bucket was not saved. Charlie Bucket was recruited. Charlie Bucket is the next Willy Wonka. And when Charlie grows up and fully understands what he inherited, the question will not be whether he perpetuates the system. The question will be whether he perfects it. That is the inheritance of Wonka's hell. Not the chocolate, not the magic, not the Oompa Loompas singing. The inheritance is continuity, the certainty that the system will survive its creator because it already found a successor young enough to be shaped and desperate enough to accept the shaping without questioning the cost. Close your eyes and picture Augustus gloop in the pipes. Picture Violet Beauregard rolling across the floor while the Oompa Loompas perform the melody they rehearsed weeks in advance. Picture Veruca Salt falling down the garbage chute while her father reaches for her from above. Picture Mike TV, miniaturized, irrelevant, the weight of his arrogance now literal and physical. And picture Charlie Bucket looking at all of it from above, from the glass elevator, while Willy Wonka smiles in that peculiar and unsettling way of his and thinks, yes, that one. That one will take care of things when I no longer can. The boat had the exact right number of seats. The Oompa Loompas already knew every song. The rooms were already prepared. The pipes already had the right pressure. And Charlie's ticket had already been planned before Charlie ever knew he was participating in something. Because nothing that happened inside Willy Wonka's chocolate factory was an accident. Nothing.